There's something I've been turning over in my mind for a while now, and I've decided the only way to put it down is to start at the beginning and not skip the parts that are hard to say. I want to ask you something before I get into it. Have you ever had a moment where you looked back at a stretch of time, maybe 3 months, maybe 6, and realized that what you thought was happening was not what was happening at all? That the story you were living in had a different author than you thought? Because that's where I am now, and I'm 67 years old, which means I've had enough time to think I knew how people worked. I was wrong. My name is Arthur. I'm 67, and I live in Greenville, South Carolina, in the same house my wife and I bought the year our younger son started 2nd grade. Patricia passed away 2.5 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. From the day she told me something felt wrong to the day I drove home from the hospital alone, it was 4 months and 11 days. I know the number because I counted, and I'm not sure I've stopped counting since. The house is a 4-bedroom on a quiet street off Pelham Road. We raised 2 boys here. Mowed that same strip of lawn every Saturday from 1989 until the year my knees decided they had opinions. I worked 28 years as a licensed insurance adjuster for a regional firm, then another 4 as an independent contractor before I retired. I know how to read a document. I know how to look at something and find what's missing. I thought that made me careful. I thought careful was enough. My younger son, Nathan, is 38. He lives here in Greenville, about 12 minutes from me, with his wife, Corin, and their little girl, who just turned 5. Nathan does well. He works in commercial lending, has a good eye for numbers, presents himself well. When he shakes your hand, he looks you straight in the eye. I used to tell people that about him. I used to say it like it was a compliment. My older son, Owen, is 42. He lives in Portland, Oregon. We talk every couple of weeks. He's quieter than his brother, always was, works in landscape architecture. He married a woman named June 3 years ago, and I like June very much. She asks real questions. She remembers the answers. After Patricia died, Nathan was the one who stepped up. He came by more often. He helped me sort through some of the paperwork her passing left behind. He took me to a few appointments when I didn't feel like driving. I let him, partly because I needed it, and partly because it made him feel useful, and I understood wanting to feel useful when you've just lost your mother. We were both finding our way through something neither of us had words for. About 8 months ago, Nathan came over on a Sunday afternoon with Corinne and the little one. After lunch, after the little girl had wandered off to the backyard, Nathan mentioned that he'd been thinking about my finances. Not in an alarming way, not at first. He said the way things were set up, split across different accounts, the old joint accounts I hadn't fully restructured since Patricia, the retirement accounts, the annuity she'd held, it was probably more complicated than it needed to be. He said he'd been talking to someone, a financial advisor his firm worked with, and that she might be able to help simplify things. He said it the way you'd suggest a good mechanic, offhand, like it had just occurred to him. I told him I'd think about it. He didn't push. 3 weeks later, he brought it up again. This time, he had a name. Theodore Marsh, not the woman he'd mentioned before, which I noticed but didn't say anything about. He said Theodore specialized in retirement income planning, that he'd helped several of Nathan's clients' parents get their affairs in order. That phrase, get their affairs in order, I remember it now differently than I did then. I met with Theodore once at a coffee shop on Main Street, not at an office. He was pleasant enough, mid-50s, wore a blazer over a golf shirt. He asked about my accounts, my monthly income from the pension and Social Security, whether I had a trust set up, whether my estate documents were current. He didn't push anything on me. He said he just liked to get a full picture before making any recommendations. I gave him a general sense of things without going into specifics because that's how I was trained to operate. You don't hand anyone the full picture until you know what they're planning to paint. I told Nathan the meeting had gone fine. I said I'd follow up. I didn't follow up. The person who changed everything was my friend Wendell. Wendell and I have known each other since 1987. We met at a continuing education course for adjusters. 2 guys who were both too stubborn to admit they hadn't understood the section on liability subrogation. We've had breakfast together most Wednesday mornings for the better part of 2 decades at a diner on Augusta Street that still uses paper placemats. He spent 30 years as a trust officer at a regional bank before retiring. He is not an excitable man. I have seen him hear bad news and respond by taking a slow sip of coffee. That's the kind of steady he is. I was telling him about the Theodore meeting, more to hear myself talk through it than because I thought anything was wrong. Wendell listened the way he always does, not interrupting, letting me get to the end of it. Then he set his coffee mug down very carefully, the way you set something down when you want your hands free to think. He asked me what Theodore's credentials were. I said I hadn't looked them up. He asked whether Nathan had ever introduced me to this Theodore in a formal setting, at an office with paperwork. I said no. He asked if I'd given Theodore access to any account numbers or statement documents. I said I'd mentioned ballpark figures in conversation, nothing written down. Wendell looked at me for a moment, then he said, "Arthur, how long ago did Nathan first bring this up?" I said about 2 months. He said, "And how many times has he circled back to it since?" I counted. 4 times. Nathan had mentioned it or referenced it 4 times in 2 months, Wendell said. "I want you to do something for me. Go home and look at your estate documents. Who's listed as your agent under your durable power of attorney?" I drove home that afternoon with something sitting behind my sternum, the kind of feeling that isn't pain exactly but takes up the same space. I pulled out the accordion folder where Patricia and I had always kept the estate documents. The power of attorney was from 2009. We'd had everything drafted when the boys were still young, before we thought much about which one of them might be standing beside us in a hospital someday. The agent listed was Nathan. I'm not saying that was wrong in 2009. At the time, he lived locally and Owen had just moved out of state. It made practical sense. But I sat at the kitchen table with that document in my hands, and I thought about how much had changed in 15 years, and I thought about Theodore Marsh meeting me at a coffee shop without a business card, and I thought about Nathan saying, "Get your affairs in order," and I thought about the way Wendell had set his coffee mug down. I called Wendell that evening. He listened to what I'd found. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to come look at something with you on Saturday. Don't sign anything before then. Don't agree to any meetings." Wendell came over Saturday morning and we sat at the kitchen table with all of it spread out. The estate documents, the annuity paperwork, the account statements I'd printed. He went through each one slowly. He has a particular way of reading financial documents. Head slightly down, one finger tracking across the page. I watched his face while he read. When he got to the annuity, he stopped. He turned the page over. He turned it back. He said, "Arthur, has anyone from the annuity company contacted you recently about beneficiary updates or account changes?" I said no, not that I knew of. He said, "Has Nathan ever asked you to sign anything, even something that felt routine?" I thought about it. 2 months ago, Nathan had brought over a form he said was related to the joint account Patricia and I had shared, something about removing a deceased account holder, updating my sole ownership status. I'd signed it. I hadn't read it closely because it sounded administrative. The kind of paperwork death generates that you just move through because it keeps coming and you're tired. Wendell asked me if I still had a copy. I did not. He said, "Get your bank on the phone tomorrow morning. Ask them to pull up every document associated with your accounts in the last 6 months and to read you the changes. Don't mention Nathan. Just ask." I slept badly that night, not because I was certain something was wrong, but because I was starting to understand that I didn't know for sure that something wasn't. That gap, the space between knowing and not knowing, is its own kind of weight. The next morning, I called my bank. I asked to speak with someone in account services. It took 3 transfers and 20 minutes on hold, but eventually I was speaking with a woman named Charlotte who pulled up my records. She read me the changes from the last 6 months. There had been 2. One was the account update I'd signed, removing Patricia as joint holder. The other was a beneficiary designation change on the annuity, made 6 weeks after the first, routing the death benefit to a secondary designation I hadn't set up. I asked Charlotte to read me the name on the secondary designation. She read it. It was a trust. Not a trust I recognized. Not a trust I recognized when I called him afterward. A trust with a name that had no connection to my family, to any attorney I had ever worked with, to anything I could trace. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after I hung up with Charlotte. There's a thing that happens when something you trusted turns out to be something else. It isn't like in movies, where the music swells and the character has a dramatic realization. It's quieter than that. It's more like a room you thought you knew, suddenly having a different smell. Everything looks the same. Something has changed. I did not call Nathan. That was the hardest thing I didn't do that day. Owen called that evening, one of our regular check-ins. I talked to him for 40 minutes about nothing that mattered. About the weather in Portland, about how his tomatoes were coming in, about how Patricia used to say that anyone who could grow tomatoes in the Pacific Northwest deserved a medal. My voice didn't shake. I'm not sure how. The next morning, I called my attorney. His name is Robert Keene. He handled Patricia's estate and has known me for 15 years. He is the kind of attorney who calls you back the same day and charges you honestly. I asked his assistant if I could see him before the office opened. She said yes. I sat in Robert's office at 7:45 in the morning with the printout Charlotte had faxed me and the estate document folder on the table between us. He read. He asked one question partway through and then he finished reading and looked up. He said, "Arthur, that trust designation, was it there when you signed the annuity paperwork originally?" I said it was not. He said, "Then it was changed after. And if you didn't authorize that change in writing with a wet signature, we have a problem that belongs in front of the annuity company's legal department, not just their customer service line." He paused. "And potentially in front of the Attorney General's office." He told me not to change any of my behavior, not to move any accounts, not to confront anyone. He said he'd make some calls and that we'd meet again by end of week. He also told me to write everything down. Dates, conversations, anything I could remember Nathan saying about Theodore Marsh, about my finances, about my estate planning. He said courts give weight to contemporaneous notes. He said people of my generation understood that kind of record-keeping better than most. I went home and wrote for 3 hours at the kitchen table. Longhand on a yellow legal pad, the kind Patricia always bought in bulk from the office supply store on Woodruff Road. 14 pages. I wrote down every conversation I could recall, with dates I could estimate or confirm, and then I called Wendell and he helped me cross-reference some of the timing against our Wednesday breakfasts, because he keeps a calendar going back 11 years. That gave me anchors. A week passed. Nathan texted twice. Once to ask about the little girl's birthday dinner. Once to ask if I'd had a chance to follow up with Theodore. I texted back cheerfully both times. I said I'd been meaning to call Theodore, that had just gotten away from me. Nathan said no rush. No rush, I wrote that down. Robert called 4 days later. He had spoken with the annuity company's legal team. The designation change had been submitted with a signed form, but the signature was being examined. He'd also spoken with a colleague who handled elder financial exploitation cases. He said we needed to contact the South Carolina Attorney General's office, specifically the division that handled elder financial abuse. He said there might also be grounds for a referral to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, depending on what the signature examination showed. He said, "I want you to understand something, Arthur. What you're describing, if it holds up, isn't just a family dispute. It's potentially a felony." I drove home from that meeting and parked in the driveway and sat there for a while before going inside. The hardest part was not knowing how much Sandra knew, how much Corinne knew. Whether this was Nathan alone, or whether the woman I'd watched hold my granddaughter at her birthday party had sat across a table from her husband and helped him plan it. I didn't know how to hold both possibilities at the same time, but I had to. That weekend, Nathan called and invited me to dinner on Sunday. He said it would be low-key, just the four of us, that Corinne was making her pot roast, the one she knew I liked. I said I'd love to come. Sunday dinner was a regular evening, on the surface. The little girl showed me a drawing she'd made at preschool, a house with a sun in the corner, the way children always draw suns, bright yellow, rays going in every direction. Corinne's pot roast was good. Nathan opened a bottle of red wine and poured me a glass without asking, the way he knew I preferred. After dinner, after the little one was in front of the television in the other room, Nathan said he'd been thinking about something. He said it carefully, the way someone says a thing they've been rehearsing. He said he'd spoken with Theodore again, and that Theodore had put together a proposal, something tailored to my specific situation, that would consolidate my accounts under a unified management structure for easier oversight. He said it would also, and here he paused, simplify things down the road, for the estate, for transitions. I looked at Corinne while he said this. She was looking at her wine glass. Nathan slid a folder across the table. Inside was a proposal document, clean and formatted, with my full name at the top and a signature line at the bottom. Theodore Marsh was listed as the registered investment advisor. The management entity was the same trust name Charlotte had read me over the phone. I picked up the folder. I turned a few pages slowly. I said it was a lot to take in and that I'd want to read through it carefully before doing anything. Nathan said, of course, absolutely. Take all the time I needed. He was relaxed. He topped off my wine glass. He thought we were already at the end of something. I called Robert that night. He said that's what we needed. The meeting was set for the following Thursday at Robert's office downtown. It was presented to Nathan as a routine estate planning review, something Robert had suggested to update my documents now that it had been 2 years since Patricia. Nathan accepted the invitation without much hesitation. He brought the folder. I want to tell you what it felt like to walk into that conference room knowing what was waiting there. My hands were steady. I hadn't expected that. I thought I would feel the anger in my body somewhere, in my jaw or my shoulders, or the particular tightness in my voice I've never been able to hide completely. But I walked in and sat down at the long table and looked at the city through the window, and what I felt was something closer to exhaustion than rage. Tired in the way you get tired after carrying something heavy for a long time, and you can finally see where you're going to set it down. Nathan came in with Corinne. He looked confident. He shook Robert's hand. He sat down and put the folder on the table in front of him. He looked at me with the expression I'd seen on him since he was a small boy, the one that meant he thought he already knew how something was going to go. Robert opened by thanking them both for coming. Then he placed a document on the table. He said the annuity company's legal team had completed their examination of the beneficiary designation change submitted 8 weeks ago. The signature on the authorization form had been compared against my signature on file from the original annuity contract and from 2 other recent documents I'd signed in person at the bank with a witness. The signatures did not match. Nathan said, "That's not possible." Robert placed a second document on the table. The signature comparison report from the forensic document examiner the annuity company had retained. Nathan said he didn't understand how that had happened. He said there must be some kind of error. He said Theodore had handled everything through proper channels. Robert said, "We'd like to hear more about what channels those were, and we've asked the Attorney General's office to send a representative to this meeting who can speak to that directly." The representative was a woman who worked in the Elder Financial Exploitation Unit. She had a yellow legal pad and a pen, and a manner that was not unkind but was entirely without softness. She introduced herself and sat down and placed her own folder on the table, and Nathan looked at it the way a man looks at something he cannot stop and knows it. Over the next hour, it came out. Theodore Marsh was not a licensed investment advisor in South Carolina. His registration had lapsed 4 years ago and had not been renewed following a complaint filed by a client in Spartanburg. He and Nathan had been in contact for over a year. The trust that had been named as secondary beneficiary on my annuity was an entity Theodore had established. Not me, not anyone connected to me. The authorization form with the mismatched signature had been submitted through the annuity company's online portal, using credentials that had been accessed from a device registered to Nathan's home network. Nathan said, "I was trying to protect you." He said it to me, not to Robert, not to the woman with the yellow legal pad. He said it the way someone says something when they've run out of other options. He said he'd been watching me struggle since Patricia died. He said he'd been worried about me making bad decisions, letting money sit in accounts that weren't earning, not having a real plan. He said he thought that if the right structure was in place, the right people in charge, I'd be taken care of properly. He said Patricia would have wanted him to look after me. When he said Patricia's name, I looked at him. I didn't look away. I said, "Your mother balanced our accounts at the kitchen table every month for 31 years. She paid the property taxes early every single year because she didn't like owing anything to anyone. She raised you in this house that she and I worked for together. Do not tell me what she would have wanted." Nathan sat back. Corinne was crying quietly. I believe she hadn't known the full shape of it. There are things I'll probably never know for certain about what she knew and when, but the way she sat in that chair, turned slightly away from her husband, told me something real. There was no dramatic moment. No one was taken away in handcuffs that morning. What there was instead was an investigation that had already begun, a referral to the Financial Crimes Unit, and a meeting between Robert and Nathan's attorney later that week that I was not present for and did not need to be. I drove home alone. The summer heat in Greenville in July is the kind that makes the air above the pavement look like it's thinking about leaving. I stood beside my car in the driveway for a moment and looked at the house. The paint I'd had redone 2 summers ago. The front porch where Patricia used to sit with her coffee in the mornings before it got too hot. I stood there long enough that the neighbor's sprinkler went through a full cycle. Then I went inside. The first call I made was to Owen. I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. The way he gets quiet for long quiet when something is too large for the immediate response. Then he said he was booking a flight for the following weekend. He said he wanted to sit at the kitchen table with me and go through everything together. I said that sounded right. The second call I made was to Wendell. He answered on the second ring the way he usually does. I told him it was done. He didn't say he told me so because that's not who Wendell is. He just said, "Good, come for breakfast Wednesday." I said I would. I spent the following week with Robert working through what needed to change and what needed to be protected. The power of attorney was revised. Owen was named as agent with a professional co-trustee from Robert's firm as a check. The estate documents were updated entirely. New account credentials, new beneficiary designations, confirmed in writing and witnessed. Everything on file. I also set up a standing arrangement with the annuity company that any changes to my account required a phone verification with me directly, a call to a number they had on file that was not connected to any family member's phone. That last part was Wendell's idea. He said, "Paper is good. Paper with a phone call is better." Owen came the following weekend. We sat at the kitchen table and I showed him everything, the documents, the 14 pages of notes, the signature comparison report. He read all of it the way he reads most things, carefully, without rushing. When he finished, he made us both coffee and sat back down and said, "Dad, I'm sorry I wasn't closer." I told him he had nothing to be sorry for. He said, "I know. I'm just sorry anyway." We had dinner that night at the kitchen table, the two of us. We talked about his mother for a while, the way we sometimes do when it's just the two of us and we don't have to be careful about how much space it takes up. I told him about the Saturday mornings she used to spend reorganizing the pantry when she was anxious about something. How you could always tell something was on her mind by the state of the shelves on Sunday. He laughed. He said he'd never made that connection before. After he went to bed, I sat in the living room for a while. The house was quiet in the way it's been quiet since Patricia, the particular kind of quiet that has a shape to it. I thought about Nathan setting up that meeting with Theodore at a coffee shop. 8 months of careful maneuvering. I thought about the proposal folder sliding across the dinner table. How relaxed he'd looked while he topped off my wine glass. You reach a certain age, and people start to look at you differently. Not everyone, not most people, but some. They see the house that's paid off and a pension and the years behind you, and something in their arithmetic shifts. You become, in the wrong kind of calculation, an asset to be managed rather than a person to be known. The ones who love you know the difference. The ones who don't will use the language of love so fluently you'll think you're listening to the real thing. I'm not telling you to be suspicious of everyone around you. Most people aren't Nathan, I know that. But I am telling you this. If someone in your life has started paying careful attention to the shape of your finances, your estate documents, your monthly income, not in the way someone who loves you pays attention, but in the way someone building a spreadsheet pays attention, trust what you notice. Write it down. Get your own attorney, not one someone else suggested. Have a Wendell, someone who's known you long enough to have nothing to gain from telling you the comfortable version of the truth. Your name on a document matters. Your signature is not a formality. Every line that asks for it is asking for something real. And the people who love you already know that. The ones who don't are counting on you not to. Call your bank and ask what's in your own file. You might be surprised what you find there. And if you find something that doesn't look right, don't wait for it to make more sense. It won't. Make a call, get in a room with someone you trust, and deal with it before someone else decides they already have. Your life, your house, your name, the things you built with someone you loved, those things deserve to be protected by you, for as long as you are able, on your own terms. Real care doesn't need administrator access. It doesn't need your signature on a form that came from someone else's printer. It shows up on a Wednesday morning at a diner on Augusta Street, orders the same thing it always orders, and tells you the truth. Thank you for being here with me for this. If any part of what I shared today felt close to something in your own life, I hope you'll talk to someone. These situations survive because people feel too embarrassed or too uncertain to say them out loud. Say them out loud. Find your Wendell. And if you're watching from Voices of Uncle Vincent, you know this is exactly the kind of story I believe needs to be heard. Take care of yourselves out there. Stay steady. I've been thinking about cause and effect a lot since all of this ended. Not in a dramatic way, just the quiet kind of thinking you do when you're washing dishes or sitting on the porch and the neighborhood gets still. What Nathan set in motion didn't happen because he was born a certain way. It happened because a series of small choices went unchecked, each one easier than the last. The first lie you tell yourself is always the most important one, the one that says what you're doing is actually help. Once you believe that, everything that follows feels justified. The paperwork, the advisor who isn't licensed, the signature on a form that wasn't yours to sign. None of it feels like wrongdoing when you've already convinced yourself you're the one being responsible. I understand that. In a way, I wish I didn't. What stopped it wasn't luck. It wasn't me being unusually smart or unusually suspicious. It was Wendell asking two careful questions over a cup of bad coffee on a Wednesday morning. That's the whole thing right there. One person who had nothing to gain from telling me anything but the truth, and the relationship we'd built over 30-some years that meant I actually listened when he went quiet. That's what I keep coming back to. The outcome of this story was determined long before the folder showed up in my account records. It was determined by the kind of person I'd chosen to keep close over the decades, and by whether I'd stayed the kind of person worth being honest with. And Tree isn't just about what you do when you're being watched. It's about the network of trust you build so slowly you almost don't notice it, until the day you need it and it holds. I didn't panic. That part wasn't courage exactly. It was closer to discipline, something I'd learned from 30 years of reading insurance claims, from understanding that the moment you react from emotion is usually the moment you hand the other side their best argument. I stayed steady not because I felt steady, but because I understood what was at stake. And I knew that steadiness was the only tool I had. And Owen, my older son who lives far away and calls every couple of weeks and asks real questions. The one who flew in and sat at the kitchen table, read 14 pages of notes without saying much, then made us both coffee. There's a kind of character that only shows itself under pressure, and Owen showed me his, quietly, without needing to be asked. Here's what I've learned, and I mean learned in the way that leaves a mark, not in the way you nod along with and forget. The people who want to take from you will always use the language of care. They will talk about protecting you and simplifying things and what your loved ones would have wanted. They will be patient and they will be charming and they will wait. What gives them power is your willingness to believe that someone who says the right words must mean the right things. Wisdom is knowing the difference between someone who loves you and someone who has learned to sound like it. Stay sharp, stay steady, and find your Wendell before you need him.